The Earl of Ashford was not a man given to softness. At 33, Edward Ashford commanded respect in every drawing room from Mayfair to Bath, not through charm, though he possessed it in abundance when required, but through a quiet, unyielding authority that settled over a room the moment he entered. His features were carved with aristocratic precision, a strong jaw, dark eyes that revealed nothing, and a mouth that rarely curved into anything approaching warmth. He was handsome in the manner of cold marble statuary, beautiful, yes, but distant, untouchable. He preferred it that way. The season of 1847 had begun with its usual parade of eager debutantes and their ambitious mothers, all circling the eligible lords like moths drawn to candlelight. Edward attended the requisite balls and soirees with the same measured composure he brought to sessions in the House of Lords. He danced when politeness demanded. He conversed when duty required. But he did not flirt, and he most certainly did not feel. Or so he believed. It was at Lady Pemberton's ball, amid the glittering chandeliers and the swell of Strauss, that he first saw her laughing. Miss Clara Whitmore was not a diamond of the first water by London's exacting standards. Her dowry was respectable but not extravagant, her family name established but not illustrious. She possessed none of the calculated elegance that characterized the season's most sought-after young ladies. What she did possess, however, was something far more dangerous, a smile that transformed her entire countenance into something luminous, something that seemed to carry sunlight in its wake. And she smiled often. Edward noticed this with immediate disapproval. He stood near one of the tall windows overlooking the garden, a glass of claret in hand, observing the dancers with the detached interest of a man who had seen 100 such evenings and expected nothing new from this one. But then her laughter rang out, genuine, unrestrained, utterly unsuitable for a young lady of breeding, and his gaze fixed upon her with an intensity that surprised him. She was dancing with young Hartley, a pleasant enough fellow with more enthusiasm than sense, and whatever he had said had sent her into peals of amusement. Her eyes, grey, he thought, or perhaps blue in this light, sparkled with unguarded joy. Her gloved hand rested on Hartley's shoulder as they turned through the figures of the dance, and she smiled at him as though he had given her the moon itself. Something cold and sharp twisted in Edward's chest. Foolish girl, he thought darkly. Does she not know how she appears? How easily such unguarded emotion can be exploited, twisted, used against her? He turned away, draining his glass with more force than necessary. But throughout the evening his attention returned to her again and again, drawn by some magnetism he could neither understand nor approve. She smiled at everyone, at the dowagers who spoke to her, at the servants who passed with trays, at her dance partners and the wallflowers alike. It was indiscriminate, this warmth of hers, and it grated against something deep within him, something he refused to examine too closely. When Lady Pemberton, ever the determined matchmaker, finally maneuvered an introduction, Edward's expression remained perfectly neutral. "My lord, may I present Miss Clara Whitmore? Miss Whitmore, the Earl of Ashford." She curtsied with proper decorum, but when she rose, that damnable smile was already forming on her lips. "My lord, what a pleasure. I have heard much of your work in Parliament regarding the Factory Acts. My father speaks most highly of your principles." Her voice was warm, her manner open. She met his gaze directly, without the coy lowering of lashes that most young ladies employed. It was unsettling. "Your father is too generous," Edward replied coolly, "though I am pleased the reforms have found support among thoughtful men." "Oh, my father is indeed thoughtful," she said, and there was that smile again, though he would argue that thoughtfulness alone achieves nothing without the courage to act upon conviction. "I believe he considers that your particular strength, Lord Ashford." It was prettily said, but Edward detected no artifice in it. She genuinely seemed to mean every word. This somehow made it worse. "And what of you, Miss Whitmore?" he heard himself ask, though he had intended to excuse himself after the minimum politeness required. "Do you share your father's interest in such matters?" "I find it difficult not to care about the welfare of others, my lord," she replied, her expression growing more serious, though warmth still lingered in her eyes. "When one has been blessed with comfort and security, does one not bear some responsibility toward those less fortunate?" "A noble sentiment," Edward said, and his tone carried an edge he did not entirely intend. Though I have found that sentiment and practical action are often separated by a considerable gulf. Something flickered across her face. Not offense, but something closer to curiosity. Then I must endeavor to ensure my sentiments are matched by actions, Lord Ashford. Though I suspect you are not a man who offers approval easily. I am not a man who offers approval carelessly, he corrected. There is a distinction. Indeed there is, she agreed. And then, impossibly, she smiled at him, a softer version of that radiant expression she had bestowed so freely throughout the evening. I shall consider myself duly warned, my lord. Before he could formulate a response, her next partner appeared to claim his dance, and she curtsied again before departing. Edward watched her go, noting with inexplicable irritation how she smiled at this new partner too, with the same warmth she had shown everyone else. Over the following weeks, Edward found himself in Miss Whitmore's vicinity with increasing frequency. It was mere coincidence, of course. They moved in the same circles, attended the same functions. That his gaze should seek her out in crowded rooms meant nothing beyond a natural vigilance regarding her continued want of proper reserve. And she continued to smile at everyone. She smiled at old Lord Cavendish as he told his interminable stories of his diplomatic service. She smiled at the fortune hunters who clustered around the season's heiresses. She smiled at ladies who whispered behind their fans and gentlemen who stared too, boldly. It was maddening in its consistency, this generous distribution of her warmth, and Edward felt his jaw tighten each time he witnessed it. He told himself it was concern for her reputation. A young lady who displayed her emotions so openly invited speculation, invited those who would take advantage. Someone needed to guide her toward more appropriate conduct. When next they met, at a musicale hosted by the Duchess of Waverley, Edward maneuvered the conversation with deliberate purpose. "Miss Whitmore," he began, after the soprano had concluded her performance and the audience had scattered into smaller groups. "Might I offer you some advice?" She turned to him with interest, her fan resting idle in her hands. "Of course, Lord Ashford. I am always willing to learn." "You have a generous nature," he said carefully, choosing his words with precision. "It does you credit in many respects. However, in society, such openness can be misinterpreted. A young lady must guard her expressions, her manner with greater care." Her brow furrowed slightly. "I am not certain I understand your meaning, my lord." "You smile readily," Edward said, more bluntly than he had intended. "At everyone and everything. It gives an impression of undiscriminating warmth. Some might mistake such behavior for encouragement where none is intended." The change in her expression was subtle but unmistakable. The warmth dimmed, replaced by something more guarded. "I see. You believe my manner is inappropriate." "I believe it is unwise," he corrected. "You are young, Miss Whitmore, and perhaps do not yet understand how easily natural kindness can be misconstrued in the intricate dance of society's expectations. And you, my lord, being so much older and wiser, have taken it upon yourself to educate me in proper conduct." Her tone remained perfectly polite, but something had shifted in it, a coolness that had not been present before. "I offer guidance that any thoughtful observer might provide," Edward replied, irritation prickling at the back of his neck. "You may, of course, disregard it entirely. I merely thought you might wish to protect yourself from unwarranted speculation." Clara regarded him for a long moment, her grey eyes, definitely grey, he decided, studying his face with an intensity that made him want to look away. But he held her gaze, his own expression as impassive as ever. "Thank you for your concern, Lord Ashford," she said finally. "I shall give your words due consideration." But she did not smile when she said it, and Edward felt an inexplicable sense of loss. In the days that followed, he noticed with grim satisfaction that Miss Whitmore had taken his advice to heart, at least where he was concerned. When they encountered one another at various functions, she greeted him with perfect courtesy, but without the warmth she had initially shown. Her smile, when directed at him, was polite and contained, revealing nothing of that inner light he had first witnessed. He told himself this was precisely what he had intended. She was learning discretion, learning to guard herself properly. That other gentleman still received her unfiltered warmth, while he received only cool politeness, was of no consequence. He had not wanted her smiles regardless. Yet on a rain-swept evening in late May, as Edward stood in the card-room at White's, half listening to Henley drone on about his new hunters, he found his thoughts drifting inexorably to a pair of grey eyes and a smile that had ceased to shine for him. He had been right to correct her behavior. He was certain of it. So why did the certainty feel so much like regret? The past was not a country Edward Ashford visited willingly. It lingered nonetheless, like a persistent shadow in peripheral vision, present even when deliberately ignored, shaping every decision, coloring every interaction with the cautious reserve that had become his defining characteristic. To understand the Earl's carefully constructed walls, one would need to venture back nearly 15 years, to a time when he had been merely Lord Edward Ashford, second son of the Duke of Pemberton, and foolish enough to believe in the transformative power of love. Her name had been Lady Beatrice Ashworth, and she had been exquisite. Edward had been 19, fresh from Oxford, still possessed of the dangerous optimism that comes before experience teaches its harsher lessons. Beatrice had been a widow of 25, sophisticated, beautiful, with knowing eyes and a laugh that promised mysteries he was desperate to unravel. She had selected him from among her many admirers with what he believed was genuine affection, had whispered words of love in darkened gardens, had made him feel as though his every thought and feeling mattered deeply to her. He had been prepared to offer her everything: his name, his fortune, his utterly besotted heart. Then his elder brother had died in a riding accident, and overnight everything had changed. Edward had become the heir. The second son with romantic notions had transformed into the future Earl of Ashford, bearer of an ancient title and considerable estates. And Beatrice, his beloved Beatrice, had shown him precisely how much his heart had truly mattered to her. "Darling Edward," she had said, her voice honey-sweet in the small parlour where she had summoned him, "you must understand that circumstances have altered considerably. As the Earl's intended, I shall be expected to... Well, we must be practical, mustn't we? Your father will expect a more suitable match now, someone younger, more biddable, a proper countess." He had stared at her, comprehension dawning with sickening slowness. "You are ending our understanding." "Not ending precisely," she had demurred, reaching out to trace one gloved finger along his jaw, a gesture that had once made his pulse race and now made his stomach turn. "Merely adjusting. You needn't look so stricken, my dear. Surely you knew what this was." "I knew what I believed it to be," he had replied, his voice strange to his own ears. "Clearly I was mistaken." She had smiled then, and he had seen it for what it truly was, the indulgent expression one might offer a naive child. "You are so very young still, Edward. You'll learn in time that emotion is a luxury. Position, security, advantage, these are the currencies that matter. I'm simply teaching you a valuable lesson. Consider me educated," he had said coldly, and had walked away from her without looking back. But the lesson had been learned far more thoroughly than even Beatrice could have anticipated. Edward's father, the old Duke, had died within the year, leaving Edward to assume the title at barely 21. He had thrown himself into his duties with fierce determination, managing estates, taking his seat in the Lords, involving himself in reforms and legislation that mattered. He had perfected the art of cool detachment, had learned to view every interaction through the lens of strategic advantage, had built walls around whatever remained of that foolish romantic boy until he was quite certain nothing could breach them. He danced when required, but never lingered. He conversed but revealed nothing of substance. He allowed eligible young ladies to display their accomplishments for his consideration, but felt nothing beyond a vague, dispassionate assessment of their suitability as a potential countess, an assessment that thus far none had satisfied. Not because they lacked beauty or breeding or fortune, but because he could not bear the thought of allowing anyone close enough to wield that kind of power over him again. And then Miss Clara Whitmore had smiled at him, and something he had believed safely buried had stirred like movement beneath winter ice. Edward stood in his study at Ashford House, rain streaming down the windows as June storms battered London, and acknowledged what he had been avoiding for weeks. His interest in Miss Whitmore was not born of appropriate concern for a naive young lady's reputation. He wanted her to smile at him the way she smiled at others, More disturbingly, he wanted to be worthy of such smiles. The admission came with bitter self-recrimination. Had he learned nothing? Clara Whitmore smiled at everyone because she was either genuinely kind, in which case her warmth held no particular meaning, or because she had mastered the art of calculated charm, even better than Beatrice had, in which case she was precisely the kind of woman he should avoid. Yet he found himself attending functions he might otherwise have declined, positioning himself in her vicinity with the careful strategy he usually reserved for parliamentary maneuvers, watching for any sign that her coolness toward him might thaw. It did not. She remained unfailingly polite, but the warmth he had witnessed that first evening, the unguarded joy, the luminous quality of her smile, was withheld from him completely. With others, she was her usual self. With him, she was courteous, distant, perfectly correct. He had achieved precisely what he claimed to want. So why did it gnaw at him with increasing persistence? At Lady Rothschild's garden party, Edward found himself standing near the refreshment table, ostensibly engaged in conversation with Thornbury about the upcoming vote on Corn Law amendments, but in truth, watching Clara as she strolled through the rose garden with a group of young ladies. She was listening to something Miss Hartwell was saying, her expression attentive, and then she laughed. That genuine, unrestrained sound that seemed to carry warmth in its very timbre. "You're staring, Ashford," Thornbury observed mildly. Edward's jaw tightened. "I'm doing nothing of the sort." "If you say so." Thornbury's tone suggested profound skepticism. "Though if you're interested in Miss Whitmore, you might consider actually speaking to her rather than glowering at her from across the lawn." "I am not glowering." "You absolutely are. You have been since she arrived. One might almost think you disapprove of her, were it not for the rather telling intensity of your attention." Edward turned to his friend with cool displeasure. "Your imagination is running wild, Thornbury." "Is it?" Thornbury took a sip of his champagne, looking thoroughly entertained. "Because from where I stand, you've been circling Miss Whitmore for weeks like a hawk studying particularly. Interesting prey, yet you never actually swoop. Most unlike you when you've identified something you want." "I do not want—" Edward stopped himself, recognizing the trap. "The young lady requires guidance in proper conduct, nothing more." "Ah, yes, how very charitable of you," Thornbury said dryly. "Though I must say she seems to be managing quite well without your stern supervision. Popular girl, our Miss Whitmore. Genuine too, which is refreshing in a season full of calculating misses. No, wonder half the eligible men in London are half in love with her." The statement landed with more force than Thornbury could have intended. Edward felt something cold settle in his chest. "Indeed," he managed. "She is certainly generous with her attentions." "Oh, not like that," Thornbury corrected, catching Edward's implication and frowning. "Don't be crude, Ashford. She's simply kind. One of those rare creatures who actually likes people and isn't afraid to show it, though I have noticed. She's considerably more reserved with you. Can't imagine why." "Because I told her to guard her smiles," Edward thought, with sudden sharp clarity. "Because I took something beautiful and unguarded and told her it was a flaw that needed correction." The realization struck him with uncomfortable force. He had not been protecting her. He had been protecting himself from the dangerous appeal of someone whose warmth might slip past his defenses, who might make him feel things he had sworn never to feel again. And in doing so, he had extinguished something precious, at least where he was concerned. "Excuse me, Thornbury," Edward said abruptly. "There is someone I must speak with." He crossed the lawn with measured strides, his heart beating with uncharacteristic irregularity. Clara was sitting on a stone bench beneath a climbing rose, momentarily alone as her companions had drifted toward the refreshment table. She looked up as he approached, and he saw her expression shift. Not precisely. Guarded, but certainly cooler than the warm afternoon warranted. "Lord Ashford," she greeted him, inclining her head politely. "Miss Whitmore, might I join you for a moment?" She gestured to the space beside her on the bench, and he sat, maintaining proper distance between them. For a long moment neither spoke. Edward found himself uncharacteristically at a loss for words, uncertain how to bridge the gap his own actions had created. "The roses are particularly fine this year," Clara said, finally breaking the silence with social grace. "Lady Rothschild's gardeners are to be commended." "Indeed." Edward paused, then continued with careful deliberation. "Miss Whitmore, I fear I may have spoken inappropriately when last we had occasion for private conversation. Her eyebrows rose slightly. At the Duchess of Waverley's musicale, do you mean? Yes. I offered advice that, upon reflection, may have been presumptuous. You told me I smiled too readily and should guard my expressions. With greater care, Clara said evenly, that my warmth might be misconstrued as encouragement. Yes. Edward kept his gaze fixed on the roses rather than meeting her eyes. I believed I was offering useful guidance. I now think I may have been mistaken in my assessment. Mistaken? There was something in her voice he could not quite identify. In what particular aspect, my lord? In suggesting that your natural warmth is a fault requiring correction. The admission came with difficulty. Years of carefully maintained reserve, warring against an unfamiliar compulsion toward honesty. You are as you are. Perhaps there is no need to alter that. Silence stretched between them. Edward finally forced himself to look at her and found her studying him with an expression of mingled surprise and something else, something that might have been disappointment. I am as I am, she repeated softly. And yet, Lord Ashford, you found what I am to be wanting. Insufficient, unwise. Those were your words, if I recall correctly. I spoke from... He stopped himself. What could he say? That he had spoken from fear, from bitter experience that had nothing to do with her, from the desperate need to maintain walls that her smile threatened to undermine? I spoke from a limited perspective, he said finally, one shaped by experiences that are not your burden to bear. Clara rose from the bench, smoothing her skirts with hands that, Edward noticed, trembled slightly. Thank you for your honesty. Lord Ashford, it is more than many would offer. She met his eyes then, and he saw something in her gaze that made his chest tighten. But you need not concern yourself further with my conduct or my character. I release you from any imagined obligation to guide me toward behavior you find more suitable. Miss Whitmore, if you will excuse me, my lord, I believe Miss Hartwell is signaling for my attention. She curtsied with perfect propriety and walked away, her spine straight, her movements graceful, leaving Edward sitting alone among the roses with the uncomfortable realization that he had just lost something he had never actually possessed, but wanted, he acknowledged silently, watching her rejoin her friends and seeing her smile return as she entered their circle. He wanted it more than he could reasonably justify, and he had no earthly idea what to do about it. If Edward Ashford had thought his attempted apology would bridge the distance he had created, the following weeks proved him thoroughly mistaken. Clara Whitmore was nothing if not consistent in her newly acquired coolness toward him. She was never rude. Such overt discourtesy would be beneath her, but she maintained a polite distance that was somehow worse than open hostility. When circumstances forced conversation, she participated with irreproachable courtesy and absolute emotional vacancy, as though he were merely another piece of furniture requiring acknowledgement. Meanwhile, she continued to bestow her warmth on seemingly everyone else in London society. Edward told himself this did not matter. He had centuries of aristocratic breeding at his disposal, an unshakable sense of his own consequence, and absolutely no need for the approval of one provincial young lady with more heart than sense. Yet he found himself attending Lady Blackwood's ball with an eagerness he refused to examine too closely, arriving earlier than his usual fashionably late entrance, his eyes scanning the ballroom with purpose he would not admit even to himself. He located her almost immediately. She stood near the musicians' gallery, deep in conversation with Lord Ashton. The Viscount was younger than Edward by several years, possessed of easy charm and ready laughter, and was known throughout the ton as an amiable, harmless sort of fellow. Women liked him because he made them feel comfortable. Men liked him because he bore no threat to their own social standing. Edward had never particularly cared for him, one way or another, until he saw Clara smile at something Ashton said, that full, genuine smile that transformed her entire countenance, and felt something dark and possessive unfurl in his chest. She was wearing blue silk that evening, a gown that should have been unremarkable but somehow made her eyes appear more grey than usual, luminous in the candlelight. Her hair was dressed simply, with none of the elaborate arrangements favoured by more fashion-conscious ladies, but the simplicity suited her. She looked like herself, Edward thought, unaffectedly lovely in a way that had nothing to do with artifice, and everything to do with the unguarded warmth that still, even after his criticism, radiated from her when she forgot to guard it. She did not guard it with Ashton. Edward watched as they moved into the dance. A waltz, naturally, because fate had apparently decided to be particularly cruel that evening. Ashton's hand rested at Clara's waist, properly positioned but somehow appearing. More intimate than Edward's rigid sense of propriety could tolerate. They were conversing as they danced, and Edward could see Clara laughing at something Ashton said, her expression open and delighted. "She's quite taken with him, isn't she?" Edward turned to find Lady Thornbury at his elbow, his friend's wife regarding him with knowing eyes that missed nothing. "I have no idea to whom you refer," Edward replied coolly. "Of course you don't," Lady Thornbury said with thinly veiled amusement. "Just as you haven't been watching Miss Whitmore and Lord Ashton for the past 10 minutes, with an expression that would curdle milk. Tell me, Ashford, when did you become so transparent?" "I am merely observing the dancing," Edward said, though he could hear the lack of conviction in his own voice. "Certainly, and I am merely noting that Lord Ashton has been pursuing Miss Whitmore quite determinedly this past fortnight. He's a good match for her, kind disposition, adequate fortune, genuinely fond of her. They suit each other well, don't you think?" Something twisted painfully beneath Edward's ribs. "If you say so." "I do say so. In fact, there's talk that he may make her an offer before the season ends." Lady Thornbury paused delicately. "Unless, of course, someone else intends to declare his interest. Competition has a way of focusing the mind, I've found." Edward's jaw tightened. "Lord Ashton is welcome to pursue Miss Whitmore if he wishes. I have no claim on the lady's affections." "No," Lady Thornbury agreed. "You absolutely do not. You made quite certain of that, from what I understand. Pity, really. She's exactly the sort of woman a man like you needs, someone who might actually convince you to feel something again." Before Edward could formulate a suitably cutting response, Lady Thornbury had drifted away, leaving him alone with observations he had no desire to acknowledge. The waltz concluded, and Edward watched as Ashton escorted Clara from the floor, his hand lingering at her elbow just a moment longer than strictly necessary. They moved toward the refreshment tables, and Edward found himself following at a careful distance, positioning himself where he could overhear their conversation without appearing to eavesdrop. "You are too kind, my lord," Clara was saying, accepting a glass of champagne with a smile that made Edward's hands clench at his sides. "I fear you overestimate my abilities considerably." "On the contrary," Ashton replied warmly. "I've heard you play, Miss Whitmore, and I assure you my praise is entirely justified. Your interpretation of Chopin was the finest I've heard outside a concert hall. You have a genuine gift." "You shall make me quite insufferable with such compliments," Clara said, but her eyes sparkled with pleasure at his words. "Impossible," Ashton declared. "You haven't a vain bone in your body. It's one of the many things that is, one of the many admirable qualities you possess," he had nearly said. Something else, Edward realized with sudden, sharp clarity. Something more personal, more revealing. Clara had noticed too, judging by the slight color that rose in her cheeks, but she did not seem displeased by the Viscount's near declaration. Instead, she smiled at him with a softness that made Edward want to overturn the nearest table. "You are very good to me, Lord Ashton," Clara said quietly. "More than I perhaps deserve." "Nonsense. You deserve every good thing this world can offer." The simple sincerity in Ashton's voice was somehow worse than flowery poetry would have been. He meant it, Edward could tell. The man was genuinely, thoroughly smitten with Clara Whitmore, and he made no effort to conceal it. Why should he? He had done nothing to forfeit her good opinion. He had not told her that her natural warmth was a fault requiring correction. He had not rejected the gift of her smile and then regretted it too late. Edward turned away sharply, unable to watch any more. He made his way to the card room with movements that betrayed none of the turbulence he felt, settled himself at a table with Henley and Blackwood, and proceeded to lose 3 hands in a row through sheer inattention. "Steady on, Ashford," Henley said cheerfully. "You're playing like a green boy, something troubling you?" "Nothing whatsoever," Edward replied tersely, and forced himself to concentrate on his cards. But throughout the evening, he was aware of Clara and Ashton moving through the ballroom. They danced twice more, the maximum propriety allowed, and spent the intervals between dances in apparently absorbing conversation. Other gentlemen approached Clara, but she seemed to give Ashton preference, returning to his side repeatedly, laughing at his observations, listening with genuine interest when he spoke. Edward left the ball early, claiming a headache he did not have, and rode through London's night-darkened streets with his thoughts churning in uncomfortable directions. He had no right to feel this gnawing jealousy. He had deliberately pushed Clara away, had criticized the very qualities that made her who she was, had treated her warmth as though it were a failing rather than the extraordinary gift it actually was. Of course, she had turned elsewhere. Of course, she had found someone who appreciated what he had rejected. Lord Ashton was a good man. He would make Clara happy. He would never tell her to guard her smiles, never treat her openness as weakness, never subject her to the cold distance that Edward wielded like armor against all possible pain. She deserved better than Edward could offer. He knew this, yet knowing it did nothing to quell the fierce possessiveness that surged through him every time he thought of her smiling at Ashton the way she had once briefly smiled at him. The following week brought a garden party at the Thornburys' Richmond estate, and Edward attended despite knowing full well that both Clara and Ashton would be present. He told himself he was merely maintaining his social obligations. He was not, absolutely not, seeking opportunities to torture himself with the sight of Clara bestowing her affection on another man. The afternoon was unseasonably warm, the kind of June day that made London society remember why England's poets had bothered to compose verses about summer. The Thornburys' gardens were extensive, with carefully manicured lawns giving way to more naturalistic arrangements of trees and flowering shrubs, paths winding down toward the Thames visible in the distance. Edward positioned himself near the house, conversing with various acquaintances, all while maintaining acute awareness of Clara's location. She wore white muslin that afternoon, sprigged with tiny flowers, and looked impossibly young and lovely as she moved through the garden with Miss Hartwell and Lady Pemberton's daughter. Ashton joined her group within minutes of arriving, and Edward watched as Clara's face brightened at the Viscount's approach. They fell into conversation immediately, their ease with each other apparent even from a distance. "They make a handsome couple, don't they?" Edward turned to find his host standing beside him, Thornbury's expression far too knowing for comfort. "If you say so," Edward replied non-committally. "I do say so. Ashton's been quite open about his intentions, means to offer for her any day now. Waiting for the right moment, I expect. Can't say I blame him. She's a rare find, is Miss Whitmore. The genuine article." Each word landed like a blow Edward refused to acknowledge. "I wish them both joy, then." "Do you?" Thornbury asked skeptically. "Because from where I stand, you look as though you're contemplating murder, and I'm fairly certain we can't have the Earl of Ashford arrested for killing a peer, even a minor one, in my garden." "Don't be absurd." "I'm rarely absurd, Ashford. Observant, perhaps. Tactless on occasion. But absurd? Never." Thornbury paused, then continued more seriously. "Whatever happened between you and Miss Whitmore, you might consider whether your pride is worth the cost you're paying." "There is nothing between myself and Miss Whitmore," Edward said flatly. "There never was." "No? Then why do you look at her as though she's personally responsible for every disappointment you've ever suffered, while simultaneously looking as though you'd set London ablaze if she asked you to?" Edward had no response to this, primarily because Thornbury's observation struck uncomfortably close to truths he was not prepared to examine. His friend sighed. "I've known you 15 years, Ashford. I've watched you turn yourself into marble, refusing to feel anything that might make you vulnerable. It's a sad thing to witness, particularly in a man who once had such capacity for genuine emotion. But if you've decided that life is safer lived behind walls, then I suppose that's your choice to make. Just don't pretend you're content with the decision." Thornbury walked away before Edward could formulate a response, leaving him standing alone with observations he would much rather not consider. The afternoon dragged on with interminable slowness. Edward found himself tracking Clara's movements with the precision of a military campaign, noting every time Ashton made her laugh, every gentle touch to her arm or hand, every shared glance that spoke of growing intimacy. It was while watching Clara and Ashton stroll toward the lower gardens, somewhat separated from the main party, that Edward felt something inside him finally crack. He could not do this. He could not stand here, civilized and contained, and watch Clara Whitmore fall in love with another man without at least acknowledging what he felt, even if it was too late, even if she had every right to reject him, even if his pride would be shattered in the process. Without allowing himself time to reconsider, Edward set down his glass and followed the path Clara and Ashton had taken, his heart hammering in a most undignified manner. He found them standing beneath an ancient oak, partially screened from the rest of the party by carefully arranged shrubbery. They stood close together, and as Edward approached, not concealing himself but not announcing his presence either, he heard Ashton's voice, low and earnest. "Miss Whitmore, Clara, if I may, I have waited these weeks to find the right moment, but I find I can wait no longer. You must know how deeply I admire you, how much I have come to—" "Please," Clara interrupted gently, and Edward saw her place one hand on Ashton's arm. "My lord, you honor me greatly, but I must ask you to pause before you say something we might both regret." Ashton's expression fell. "You are refusing me before I've even asked the question." "I am attempting to spare us both an awkward moment," Clara said softly. "You are everything kind and good, Lord Ashton. Any woman would be fortunate to receive your regard, but my heart is not, that is, I cannot offer you what you deserve." "Your heart is otherwise engaged," Ashton said, with the air of a man confirming an unwelcome suspicion. Clara's silence was answer enough. Edward stood frozen, concealed by the oak's massive trunk, unable to move or breathe or think beyond the single overwhelming question. "With whom?" "Forgive me," Clara said finally, her voice barely audible. "I wish it were otherwise. I wish I were capable of returning your affection, but I find I cannot command my heart, as reason would dictate." "May I at least know the identity of my rival?" Ashton asked, a tempting lightness though pain threaded through his words. "Is he aware of his good fortune?" "He is not my rival," Clara replied quietly. "And no, I do not believe he is aware, nor would it matter if he were. My feelings are not returned, nor have I any expectation that they might be." "Then he is a fool," Ashton said with surprising vehemence. "Whoever he is an absolute fool, and I hope someday he realizes precisely what he has lost." "You are kind to say so," Clara murmured, "though I suspect the fault lies with me rather than with him. I am not what he seeks, and there is no remedy for that." They spoke a few moments longer, Ashton accepting his dismissal with grace that spoke well of his character, before making their way separately back toward the house. Edward remained concealed behind the oak, his thoughts in absolute chaos. Clara loved someone who did not return her affection, someone she believed did not want her. The possibility that he might be that someone had not occurred to him until this moment. It seemed impossible. He had done nothing to earn her regard, everything to forfeit it. He had been cold, critical, dismissive of the very qualities that made her extraordinary. Yet Lady Thornbury's words returned to him. "You look at her as though she's personally responsible for every disappointment you've ever suffered, while simultaneously looking as though you'd set London ablaze if she asked you to." And Clara's own words to Ashton, "I am not what he seeks, and there is no remedy for that." Edward emerged from behind the oak on unsteady legs, his usual composure shattered entirely. If Clara Whitmore loved him, and the possibility seemed both impossible and inevitable, then he had treated that love with criminal carelessness. He had taken something precious and rare and told her it was faulty. He had rejected a gift he had been too damaged to, recognized, too afraid to accept. And now, standing in Thornbury's garden with the late afternoon sun slanting through the leaves, Edward Ashford felt the full weight of what he had done, what he had lost, and what he might never have the chance to reclaim. The marble cracked, the walls crumbled, and beneath it all, finally, terrifyingly, he felt. Edward Ashford was not a man who acted on impulse. Impulse was for younger sons, for men without consequence, for those whose decisions affected only themselves. As the Earl of Ashford, every action carried weight, every choice reverberated through estates and tenants and the ancient legacy of his name. He did not pursue married women or engage in duels or make declarations he might later regret. Yet as he stood in Thornbury's garden, having overheard Clara's gentle refusal of Lord Ashton, Edward felt impulse warring with every principle he had spent 15 years constructing. The urge to go to her immediately, to demand whether he was indeed the object of her misplaced affection, to lay bare feelings he barely understood himself. It was nearly overwhelming. Nearly. Reason reasserted itself as he made his way back toward the house. What precisely did he intend to say? That he had overheard a private conversation not meant for his ears? That he might be capable of returning feelings he could not even properly name? That despite having pushed her away repeatedly, having criticized her very nature, having done everything possible to ensure she would never regard him warmly, he now found he could not bear the thought of her loving him unrequited. It was the height of arrogance, the pinnacle of selfish presumption. She deserved better than a man who had spent 15 years perfecting the art of emotional unavailability, better than someone who had told her that her warmth, the very core of who she was, required correction, better than an earl who had been so damaged by past betrayal that he had mistaken a gift for a threat. Edward told himself this repeatedly over the following days. He attended functions knowing Clara would be present and maintained careful distance. He did not seek her out. He did not engineer private conversations. He reminded himself with stern regularity that the honorable course was to leave her be, to allow her feelings, if they truly existed, to fade naturally, to transfer to someone more worthy, someone like Ashton, who had no compunction about declaring his admiration openly, someone who had not spent years building walls specifically designed to keep people at a distance. This resolution lasted nearly a week. It shattered completely at Lady Carstairs' musicale. The event was precisely the sort of entertainment Edward usually avoided. Too many people crowded into too small a space, forced into proximity by the arrangement of chairs facing the pianoforte, expected to sit through performances of varying quality with expressions of polite appreciation. But he had promised Lady Carstairs, who had been a friend of his late mother's, and he was not a man who broke promises. That Clara would be performing had not factored into his decision to attend. He had only learned of her inclusion in the program after arriving, when Lady Carstairs had enthused about the particular treat they were all to enjoy. "Such a gifted young woman," his hostess had said, squeezing his arm with maternal affection. "You really must hear her play, Ashford. I've rarely encountered such feeling in one so young." Edward had taken his seat near the back of the room. He preferred to observe from distance and had waited through 3 performances of competent but uninspired playing. Then Clara had moved to the pianoforte. She wore pale green that evening, a color that brought out the gray of her eyes and made her skin seem luminous in the candlelight. She settled onto the bench with graceful efficiency, arranged her skirts, and paused for a moment, her hands hovering above the keys as though gathering herself. Then she began to play. Edward was not a musician himself, though he appreciated music in the abstract way of men who had been exposed to culture as part of their education. He could not have said what piece Clara performed, something by Chopin perhaps, or one of the other modern composers favored by young ladies seeking to display their accomplishments. But he knew, immediately and with absolute certainty, that what she was playing was extraordinary. It was not mere technical proficiency, though her fingers moved across the keys with obvious skill. It was the emotion she poured into every phrase, the way she seemed to become the music itself, translating something ineffable into sound. The piece was melancholy, searching, filled with a yearning that seemed to reach into the chest and twist. Edward watched her face as she played. Her eyes were half closed, her expression distant, as though she had traveled somewhere beyond this crowded London drawing room. There was something heartbreaking in her focus, in the intensity of feeling that radiated from her. She was pouring her heart out through her fingertips, and everyone in the room could hear it. The final notes faded into silence. For a moment, no one moved, caught in the spell she had woven. Then applause erupted, enthusiastic and genuine, and Clara's expression shifted, the distant intensity replaced by something more guarded as she returned to herself, to the reality of being observed by dozens of eyes. She curtsied with proper modesty, deflecting the compliments that came from all directions, but Edward saw the tremor in her hands as she stepped away from the pianoforte, saw the brittleness in her smile as she accepted congratulations from Lady Carstairs and the other guests. Something was wrong. He could sense it with the same instinct that served him so well in Parliament, the ability to detect distress beneath polished surfaces. The musicale concluded, and guests moved toward the supper room. Edward found himself making his way through the crowd, searching for Clara with purpose that overrode his usual reticence. He located her near one of the tall windows, partially concealed by heavy drapes, and recognized the posture of someone seeking solitude in the midst of society. He should leave her be. This was not his concern. She had made it clear she wanted nothing from him beyond cold politeness. Yet he found himself approaching, regardless. "Miss Whitmore." She startled at his voice, turning quickly. In the uncertain light near the window, her eyes appeared overly bright, as though tears might be threatening. But she composed herself immediately, the mask of polite indifference settling into place. "Lord Ashford," she acknowledged coolly, "I trust you found the musical acceptable." "Your performance was exceptional," Edward said bluntly, "but you already know that." "You are too kind, my lord." "I am rarely kind," he corrected. "I am, however, truthful. And the truth is that what you played was remarkable. It was also profoundly sad." He paused, studying her face. "Are you well, Miss Whitmore?" The question seemed to surprise her. Something flickered in her expression. Vulnerability, quickly suppressed. "I am perfectly well, my lord. Why would you think otherwise?" "Because you played as though your heart were breaking," Edward said quietly. "And now you look as though you might shatter if someone speaks to you too kindly." For a moment, her composure wavered. Her eyes met his, and he saw pain there, real, deep pain that had nothing to do with anything so simple as unrequited love, for a man who had been too damaged to recognize it. "That is quite an observation from someone who has spent the past months ensuring he knows as little about me as possible," Clara said, her voice tight with restrained emotion. The accusation struck true. Edward absorbed it without defense because he deserved it. "You are right," he acknowledged. "I have been deliberately distant, for reasons that have nothing to do with you and everything to do with my own failures." "Lord Ashford." "Please," he interrupted before courage failed him. "Please, just listen for a moment. I know I have no right to ask anything of you. I know I have treated you poorly, dismissed qualities that should have been treasured, maintained distance where warmth was offered. But I am asking, despite all of that, tell me what is wrong. Let me help if I can." Clara stared at him as though he had spoken in a foreign language. "Why?" she asked finally. "Why, after months of coldness, do you suddenly concern yourself with my welfare?" "Because I love you," Edward thought with sudden, shocking clarity. "Because somewhere between your first smile and this moment, I fell in love with you, and I was too much of a coward to admit it even to myself." But he could not say that. Not here, not now, not when she was clearly distressed about something that had nothing to do with him. "Because you played Chopin as though it were a requiem," he said instead, "and because, regardless of what you may think of me, I am not so lost to basic humanity that I can watch someone suffer and do nothing." Clara's laugh was bitter, entirely unlike her usual warmth. "Basic humanity. How reassuring." She moved as though to step past him, to rejoin the other guests, but Edward caught her arm gently. "Please," he said again, and was startled by the rawness in his own voice. She stopped, though she did not look at him. For a long moment, silence stretched between them, heavy with everything unspoken. "My father is ill," Clara said finally, so quietly he had to lean closer to hear. "Very ill. The doctors have told us there is little hope. Weeks, perhaps. A month if we are fortunate." The words landed with devastating finality. Edward's hand tightened on her arm reflexively, though he was barely conscious of the gesture. "Clara, Miss Whitmore, I am so deeply..." "Sorry, are you?" She did look at him then, and her eyes were bright with unshed tears. "Are you truly? Or is this merely the appropriate thing to say? The polite expression of sympathy one offers when tragedy befalls an acquaintance?" The words were unfair, but Edward understood they came from pain, not malice. "I am truly sorry," he said steadily. "Your father is a good man. His work on the factory acts has saved countless lives. His loss will be felt far beyond your family." "Yes," Clara agreed, and a single tear escaped, tracking down her cheek before she brushed it away impatiently. "Everyone will mourn the great reformer, the champion of the poor, the man who changed Parliament's mind about child labor. Her voice broke slightly. But I will mourn my father, the man who taught me to play chess, who read me poetry when I was ill, who told me that kindness was never weakness, even when the world insisted otherwise. Something in Edward's chest cracked open completely. He had spent 15 years perfecting emotional distance, but in this moment, he found he could not maintain it. Without thinking, without calculating consequences, he pulled Clara into his arms. She stiffened immediately, clearly shocked by the breach of propriety. They were in a semi-public space, visible to anyone who happened to pass by. Such an embrace was scandalous, would provoke gossip, would require explanations neither of them could easily provide. Edward did not care. "Forgive me," he murmured against her hair. "Forgive my coldness, my pride, my unconscionable treatment of you. Forgive that I have been so concerned with protecting myself that I failed to see you clearly. But know this, Clara. You were right about kindness. Your father was right. Kindness is strength, not weakness. And you possess more strength in your smallest gesture than I have managed to cultivate in my entire life." For a heartbeat, Clara remained rigid in his embrace. Then something in her broke. She sagged against him, her hands clutching his coat, and wept silently against his chest. Edward held her, one hand cradling the back of her head, the other at her waist, and felt every wall he had so carefully constructed crumble to dust. This was what he had been protecting himself from, this vulnerability, this overwhelming need to absorb someone else's pain, to offer comfort even when he had none to give, to feel so completely that his own boundaries ceased to exist. He had been right to fear it. It was absolutely terrifying, and he would not trade this moment for all the safety in the world. "I am sorry," Clara whispered eventually, pulling back slightly, though he did not release her entirely. "I should not. We should not." "The proprieties can go hang," Edward said firmly. "You are grieving. You are allowed to accept comfort without concerning yourself with society's ridiculous rules." She looked up at him, and her smile was watery but genuine. The Earl of Ashford, enemy of propriety. Who would have imagined such a thing? "I contain unexpected depths," Edward replied, and was rewarded with a small laugh. But reality was intruding. They could not remain here indefinitely, and Clara's distress would be noticed if they did not return to the other guests. Edward released her reluctantly, though every instinct screamed at him to maintain physical contact. "When do you leave for... Where is your father?" "Hampshire, and we leave tomorrow morning." Clara had regained her composure, though her eyes remained red. "I do not know when I shall return to London. Perhaps not at all this season." Something close to panic flared in Edward's chest. She was leaving. Tomorrow. And he had wasted weeks, months, in stubborn pride and deliberate distance. "Clara," he began, then stopped. What could he say? That he loved her? He barely understood it himself. That he wanted to court her properly. Her father was dying. This was hardly the moment for romantic declarations. That he had been a fool. She already knew that. "Yes, my lord?" She watched him with an expression he could not read. Hope and resignation mingled together. "I wonder, might I call on you? In Hampshire, I mean. To see how you are managing. To offer whatever assistance might be needed." It was the wrong thing to say. He knew it immediately. Her expression shuttered, warmth replaced by something colder. "How very kind of you, Lord Ashford," she said, her tone formal. "But I must decline your generous offer. We have no need of assistance, and I am certain you have more pressing obligations here in London. Clara, thank you for your concern about my father," she continued, speaking over him as though he had not attempted to use her given name. "And thank you for your momentary comfort. But I think it best if we return to our previous understanding. Polite acquaintances, nothing more." "That is not what I want," Edward said with more force than intended. "Is it not?" Clara met his eyes directly. "Because from where I stand, my lord, it appears to be precisely what you have wanted from the beginning. Distance, propriety, cordial indifference. You have been remarkably consistent in communicating these preferences." "I was wrong," Edward insisted, "about all of it." "Perhaps," Clara allowed. "But you were wrong with such conviction, Lord Ashford. that I find myself disinclined to believe that one moment of compassion represents genuine change. People do not transform so completely, so quickly. Clara, please, I must rejoin my mother, she said firmly. She will be looking for me. If you will excuse me, my lord. She curtsied with perfect propriety and walked away, leaving Edward standing alone by the window with the taste of ashes in his mouth. He had finally broken through his own walls, finally allowed himself to feel, finally found the courage to reach for what he wanted. And Clara had rejected him, not cruelly, not unjustly, but completely. Edward remained by the window long after she had gone, staring out at the darkened London street beyond, and understood with perfect clarity that he had brought this entirely upon himself. His past had poisoned his present, his fear had cost him his future, and his pride, his damnable, inflexible pride, had ensured that when Clara Whitmore had needed him most, he had failed her so completely that she no longer trusted even his genuine offers of support. The worst part, the absolutely unbearable part, was that she was right not to trust him. He had earned her coldness, he had cultivated it deliberately, he had no one to blame but himself, and now she was leaving, and he might never have the chance to prove he could be better than the man he had shown her. The house felt empty, not physically. Ashford House contained the same furniture, the same servants, the same centuries of accumulated possessions as always, but something essential had drained from it, leaving behind spaces that echoed, with silence Edward could not fill. Clara had left London 3 days ago. Edward knew this because he had made inquiries, discreet ones through Thornbury, careful not to reveal the intensity of his interest. The Whitmore family had departed for their Hampshire estate the morning after Lady Carstairs' musicale, and there had been no word since. No mention of when or if they might return. He told himself this was for the best. Clara needed to be with her father during his final weeks or days. She needed to grieve without the additional burden of navigating London society's expectations. She certainly did not need Edward Ashford imposing his belated realizations and poorly timed emotional revelations into what was already an unbearable situation. Yet he could not stop thinking about her. She invaded his thoughts at the most inconvenient moments, during parliamentary sessions, when he should have been focused on legislation, while reviewing estate accounts that required his full attention. In the early hours of the morning, when sleep eluded him, and he found himself standing at his study window, staring out at the rain-soaked streets, and remembering how she had felt in his arms, the weight of her grief pressed against his chest. He had held her for perhaps 3 minutes. It should not have been enough to engrave the memory so indelibly into his consciousness, but it had been the first genuine moment of connection he had allowed himself in 15 years, and his body seemed determined to remember every detail. The subtle lavender scent of her hair, the way her hands had clutched his coat, the small broken sound she had made when her composure finally shattered. Edward found he could not bear it. Not the memory itself, that he would treasure despite its painful context, but the knowledge that he had pushed her away immediately afterward, that his clumsy attempt at offering support had been rejected because she, quite rightly, did not trust his motives. He had told her he wanted to help, and she had heard empty politeness. He had tried to express concern, and she had heard obligation. He had broken through every defense he possessed to hold her while she wept, and she had dismissed it as momentary compassion, not the seismic shift it actually represented. How could she have known otherwise? He had spent months ensuring she understood he wanted nothing from her, felt nothing for her. One moment of vulnerability could not erase such deliberate, sustained coldness. Thornbury found him in whites on the 4th day after Clara's departure, staring into a glass of brandy he had not touched. "You look dreadful," his friend observed, settling into the opposite chair without invitation. "Your tact is, as always, overwhelming," Edward replied without heat. "Tact is for people who need coddling. You need honesty." Thornbury signaled for his own drink. "So here is honesty. You have been walking around London like a ghost for nearly a week. You attend functions but don't engage. You sit in Parliament but don't speak. You're present in body but utterly absent in spirit. One might almost think your heart had departed for Hampshire along with a certain young lady." Edward's jaw tightened. "I am merely preoccupied with pressing matters." "Certainly. Pressing matters that have nothing whatsoever to do with Miss Whitmore." Thornbury's expression softened slightly. "Ashford, I've known you long enough to recognize when you're suffering. Why? Don't you simply go to her?" "Because she does not want me there," Edward said flatly. "She made that abundantly clear." "Did she? Or did she refuse your offer because you presented it as duty rather than desire?" The observation struck uncomfortably close to the truth. Edward took a drink of his brandy, finally more for something to do with his hands than from any desire for the alcohol. "What would you have me do, Thornbury? Appear at her door while her father lies dying and declare myself? Burden her with my feelings when she has far more important concerns? It would be unconscionably selfish. And staying away, allowing her to believe you don't care, that's selfless, is it?" Thornbury leaned forward. "Listen to me, Ashford. That young woman loves you. Lady Thornbury is certain of it, and my wife is rarely wrong about such matters. But Clara Whitmore has pride too, and you've wounded it repeatedly. If you want any chance with her, you need to prove, not say prove, that your feelings are genuine." "How?" Edward heard the desperation in his own voice and hated it. "How do I prove something I barely understand myself? I have spent 15 years ensuring I never felt anything this intensely. I don't know how to navigate it. I don't know what I'm doing." "Then you'll have to learn," Thornbury said simply. "You're one of the most intelligent men I know, Ashford. You've mastered parliamentary procedure, estate management, political strategy. Apply that same intelligence to matters of the heart. Start with the basics. She's grieving, she's frightened, she's trying to maintain composure while her world crumbles. Be there, not as an earl making a charitable gesture, but as a man who cares about her specifically, personally, irrevocably." Edward wanted to protest that it was not so simple, that his presence might be unwelcome, that he could not simply insert himself into a family crisis uninvited. But beneath the protests, he knew Thornbury was right. He had spent months pushing Clara away through deliberate distance. If he truly wanted her, and God help him, he did with an intensity that terrified him, then he would have to fight for her with equal deliberation. He would have to be vulnerable in ways he had spent years learning to avoid. He would have to risk rejection, humiliation, pain. He would have to prove through actions rather than words that he had changed. That evening, Edward sat in his study with rain hammering against the windows and attempted to write a letter. He had written thousands of letters in his life, to political allies, to estate managers, to his man of business. Words came easily when discussing legislation or crop rotations or investment strategies, but attempting to convey feeling, to express emotion he barely understood, to Clara Whitmore, who had every reason to doubt his sincerity, the words would not come. He tried various approaches: formal condolences regarding her father's illness, too cold; expressions of concern for her welfare, too impersonal; attempts at emotional vulnerability, too much, too soon, too likely to be dismissed as manipulation. Nothing felt right. By midnight, he had burned 3 attempts in the fireplace and sat staring at blank paper, the pen idle in his hand. Perhaps letters were not the answer. Perhaps some things could not be adequately expressed through written words, no matter how carefully chosen. Perhaps, as Thornbury had suggested, the answer was simply to be present. The decision made itself. Edward rose from his desk, summoned his valet, and began issuing instructions for travel preparations. They would leave for Hampshire at first light. He would present himself at the Whitmore estate and offer what? His company, his support, his willingness to do whatever might be needed, from sitting in silent companionship to managing practical matters that grief might render difficult. And if Clara refused him, if she turned him away at the door, then at least he would know he had tried. At least he would not spend the rest of his life wondering what might have happened if he had found the courage to risk his pride for something infinitely more important. He slept little that night, his mind churning with possible scenarios, with words he might say and how she might respond. But as dawn broke grey and rain soaked over London, Edward felt something he had not experienced in years: hope. It was fragile, this hope, easily crushed, but it was real, and he would protect it as carefully as he had once protected his heart. The journey to Hampshire required most of the day, made longer by muddy roads and persistent rain that seemed determined to mirror Edward's internal turbulence. He spent the hours in the carriage alternating between rehearsing what he might say and questioning every decision that had brought him to this point. What if Clara refused to see him? What if her father had already died, and his arrival was the worst possible timing? What if she had been correct in her assessment, that he was offering duty, not genuine feeling, and his presence would only burden her further? The doubts accumulated with each mile. The Whitmore estate appeared in late afternoon, a handsome manor house of grey stone, smaller than Ashford's principal seat, but well maintained and dignified. Gardens that would likely be beautiful in better weather showed evidence of careful tending, though the rain had battered the late summer flowers into submission. Edward alighted from the carriage and stood for a moment, staring at the house, gathering courage that should have been unnecessary for a man of his rank and consequence. He was the Earl of Ashford. He did not falter, except that he did, apparently, when facing a woman who had every reason to send him away. But he had come this far. He would not turn back now. Edward approached the door and knocked, rain dripping from his hat, his coat soaked despite his best efforts. A butler answered, elderly, with the dignified bearing of a long-time family retainer. "The Earl of Ashford to see Miss Whitmore," Edward said, producing his card. "I realize I arrive without warning, but the matter is, I would be most grateful if she would grant me a few moments of her time." The butler's expression revealed nothing. "Please wait here, my lord. I shall inquire." Edward waited in the entrance hall, water pooling around his boots, feeling more uncertain than he had since he was 19 years old and courting disaster with Lady Beatrice. The house was quiet, save for the ticking of a long case clock and the steady drum of rain against windows. Somewhere deeper in the house, he could hear low voices, murmurs that spoke of sickness and vigil. Mr. Whitmore was still alive, then. Edward did not know if this made his presence more or less inappropriate. Footsteps on the stairs drew his attention. He looked up, expecting the butler returning with Clara's refusal. Instead, Clara herself descended. Still wearing the same clothing she must have worn throughout the day, her hair slightly disordered, exhaustion evident in every line of her body. She stopped halfway down the stairs, staring at him with an expression Edward could not interpret. "Lord Ashford," she said quietly, "what are you doing here?" This was his moment. The prepared speeches, the careful words he had rehearsed, all of it fled in the face of her actual presence. "I came because I needed to know you were managing," Edward said simply. "Because the thought of you bearing this alone was insupportable. Because I care, Clara, regardless of whether you believe me, regardless of whether you want me here. I care." Silence stretched between them, heavy with everything unspoken. Then Clara descended the remaining stairs, her eyes bright with tears she was too tired to suppress, and Edward knew, with absolute, terrifying certainty, that whatever happened next would determine the entire course of his future. Clara stood at the bottom of the stairs, studying him with an intensity that made Edward want to look away, but forced himself to withstand. "You came all the way from London," she said finally, her voice carefully neutral. "In this weather, without warning." "Yes. Why?" It was the same question she had asked at Lady Carstairs' musicale, but this time Edward understood she was offering him another chance, perhaps his last chance. The answer mattered in ways he was only beginning to comprehend. "Because I have made many mistakes in my life," Edward began, choosing his words with excruciating care. "But the worst was convincing myself that caring for someone made me weak. That vulnerability was something to be avoided at all costs. That the safest course was to feel nothing." He paused, holding her gaze. "And then I met you, and you smiled at everyone with such unguarded warmth, and it terrified me. Because I wanted that warmth directed at me, and I knew that if I allowed myself to care, to feel, I would lose the control I had spent years perfecting." Clara's expression remained guarded, but something flickered in her eyes. "So you told me to stop smiling." "So I told you to stop smiling," Edward agreed, the words tasting bitter. "I told you that your greatest gift was a flaw requiring correction. I rejected what I most wanted, because I was too much of a coward to admit I wanted it. And I have been paying for that cowardice every day since." "Pretty words, my lord," Clara said softly. "But I have heard pretty words before from men who wanted something from me. How do I know these are anything more than another strategy, another way to maintain control?" The question was fair, more than fair. Edward had given her every reason to doubt his sincerity. "You don't," he admitted. "You have no reason to trust me. I have been cold when you offered warmth, critical when you deserved appreciation, distant when you needed connection. I hurt you deliberately, repeatedly, because I was so determined to protect myself that I could not see I was destroying something precious." He took a step closer, though he was careful not to crowd her. "But I am asking, begging if I must, for the chance to prove that I can be better. Not through words, but through action. Through presence, patience, whatever you need from me. I am not asking for your forgiveness, Clara. I know I do not deserve it, but I am asking for the opportunity to earn it." Clara wrapped her arms around herself, and Edward noticed properly for the first time how exhausted she appeared. There were shadows beneath her eyes, and her shoulders carried a weight that had nothing to do with physical burden. "My father is dying," she said quietly. "Perhaps tonight, perhaps tomorrow, perhaps next week if God is merciful. I do not have the strength to navigate your emotional awakening at the same time, Lord Ashford. I cannot manage your feelings while barely managing my own." The words struck like physical blows, but Edward absorbed them without defense. "Then don't," he said simply. "Don't manage my feelings at all. Let me manage yours instead. Or at least, let me share the burden of managing them. Whatever you need. Someone to sit with you in silence. Someone to handle practical matters so you can focus on your father. Someone to simply be present while you grieve. I am here. Not as an earl making a charitable gesture, as Edward, as the man who loves you, even though he was too damaged to recognize it until far too late." The confession emerged before he could stop it, raw and unpolished and terrifyingly honest. Clara's breath caught audibly. "You don't mean that," she whispered. "I do." Edward held her gaze steadily. "I love you, Clara Whitmore. I love your warmth, your kindness, the way you smile at the world as though it deserves your joy. I love your strength, your principles, the way you refuse to dim your light, even when cold, bitter men suggest you should. I love that you play Chopin as though your heart is speaking through your fingertips. I love that you are everything I am not, open where I am closed, generous where I am guarded, brave enough to feel deeply despite knowing how much it can hurt." Clara's eyes were bright with unshed tears. "You told me my smiling was inappropriate, that I needed to guard myself more carefully. I was wrong," Edward said firmly. "About all of it. You don't need to change, Clara. I do. And I am trying. God, I am trying, but I cannot promise I will succeed quickly or gracefully. 15 years of emotional isolation is not undone in a few weeks, but I can promise I will keep trying, that I will work every day to be worthy of what you offer so freely to everyone else. And if I can't?" Clara's voice broke slightly. "If I don't have anything to offer right now, if I am too consumed with grief to think about love or courtship or any of it, then I will wait," Edward replied without hesitation. "I will be whatever you need me to be, friend, support, distant acquaintance if that's all you can manage. I will wait months if necessary, years if you require them, because you are worth waiting for, Clara, and because I have already wasted enough time in cowardice. I refuse to waste more." Silence settled between them, broken only by the steady percussion of rain against windows and the distant ticking of the long case clock. Clara studied his face with an intensity that made Edward feel transparent, as though she could see straight through to all his damaged, desperate hope. "I loved you," she said finally, so quietly he almost missed it, "from nearly the beginning, and you made it quite clear you wanted nothing to do with my affection." Edward's chest constricted painfully. The past tense in her statement felt like a death knell. "I understand," he managed. "I have no right to expect—" "I didn't say I stopped," Clara interrupted, and something in her voice made Edward's breath catch. "I said I loved you past tense because I don't know what I feel anymore. I am so tired, Edward. Tired of hoping, tired of grieving, tired of trying to be strong when everything in me wants to shatter." "Then shatter," Edward said gently. "I'll hold the pieces until you're ready to reassemble them." A sound escaped Clara. Not quite a laugh, not quite a sob. "You cannot simply appear in Hampshire and say things like that. It's not fair." "Nothing about this has been fair to you," Edward acknowledged. "But I am here now, and I am not leaving unless you explicitly ask me to. Even then, I'll probably only retreat as far as the village inn and return tomorrow to try again." That did produce a laugh, watery but genuine. "You're persistent." "I am beginning to understand what matters," Edward corrected. "And you matter, Clara. More than my pride, more than my fear, more than anything else." Clara swayed slightly, exhaustion finally overwhelming her. Edward moved without thinking, closing the distance between them and steadying her with hands on her shoulders. "When did you last sleep properly?" he asked with gentle concern. "I don't remember," Clara admitted. "There's too much to do. My mother needs support, my father needs care, the household must be managed, and you cannot do any of it if you collapse from exhaustion." Edward made a decision. "Where is your mother?" "In my father's room. She rarely leaves his side." "Then I will sit with your father while you rest," Edward said firmly. "No arguments, Clara. You need sleep and I need to feel useful. Allow me this." "You would sit vigil with a dying man you barely know?" "I would sit vigil with the father of the woman I love," Edward corrected. "And from what I know of Mr. Whitmore, I would be honored to keep him company in whatever time he has remaining." Clara stared at him, and Edward saw the moment her resistance crumbled. She was simply too tired to keep fighting, too worn down to maintain her defenses. 4 hours, she said finally. "I will sleep for 4 hours and then you will wake me." 6 hours, Edward countered. "And I will wake you immediately if there is any change in your father's condition." "Edward, 6 hours, Clara. That is my first condition of staying." "Your first condition?" Despite her exhaustion, amusement glinted in her eyes. "How very high-handed of you, my lord." "I contain multitudes," Edward replied gravely. "Now please, show me to your father's room, then go rest. We can continue this conversation when you have slept." Clara hesitated for another moment, then nodded. "Very well, but if you make me regret this, Lord Ashford, I shall never forgive you." "Noted," Edward said solemnly, though his heart was racing. She had agreed. She was allowing him to stay, to help, to prove himself through action rather than words. It was more than he had dared hope for. Clara led him upstairs to a door at the end of a corridor. She paused before opening it, her hand on the handle. "My father he is not himself anymore," she said quietly. "The illness has taken much of his strength. He drifts in and out of consciousness. But when he is lucid, he is still brilliant, still kind, still everything a father should be." "I understand," Edward assured her. Clara opened the door to reveal a spacious bedchamber made dim by drawn curtains. A large bed dominated the room, and in it lay Mr. Whitmore, a man Edward recognized from parliamentary sessions, though he appeared decades older than his actual years. Illness had ravaged him, leaving behind a shadow of the vital, commanding presence Edward remembered. Beside the bed sat Mrs. Whitmore, holding her husband's hand, her face lined with exhaustion and grief. "Mother," Clara said softly, "this is Lord Ashford. He has come from London and has offered to sit with father while we rest." Mrs. Whitmore looked up, and Edward saw the same strength in her features that he recognized in her daughter. "That is very kind." "My lord, but surely you have more pressing obligations." "Nothing more pressing than this, madam," Edward said firmly. "Please, allow me to be of service. You and Miss Whitmore need rest. I will remain here and will summon you immediately if needed." Mrs. Whitmore studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "Very well, my lord. Though I warn you, my husband may not recognize you, and if he does wake, he may say things that don't make sense. The fever affects his mind." "I understand," Edward assured her. Clara guided her mother from the room, but paused at the door to look back at Edward. Something passed between them, gratitude perhaps, or tentative trust, before she left, closing the door softly behind her. Edward settled into the chair Mrs. Whitmore had vacated, studying the man in the bed. Mr. Whitmore's breathing was labored but regular, his face peaceful in sleep. This was the man who had raised Clara, who had taught her that kindness was strength, who had shaped her into someone who smiled at the world despite knowing its cruelties. This was the man Edward desperately wanted to impress, but would likely never have the chance to truly know. "Sir," Edward said quietly, though he had no expectation of being heard, "I know you cannot hear me, and perhaps it is cowardly to speak only when you cannot respond. But I want you to know that your daughter is extraordinary, that she has changed me in ways I am only beginning to understand, and that if you can somehow grant Me the honor of your blessing. I swear I will spend the rest of my life ensuring she never regrets allowing me into her heart." No response came, only the continued rhythm of labored breathing. Edward settled in to wait. The night passed slowly. Edward dozed intermittently, but remained alert for any change in Mr. Whitmore's condition. Once, near midnight, the older man stirred and opened his eyes. They were clouded with fever, but held a spark of awareness. "Who?" Mr. Whitmore's voice was barely audible. "The Earl of Ashford, sir," Edward said gently, leaning closer. "I am a friend of your daughter's. I am keeping you company while she rests." "Clara," Mr. Whitmore's face softened at the name. "My Clara. So bright, so strong. Must protect her." "She doesn't need protection, sir," Edward said softly. "She needs someone who recognizes her strength and cherishes it, rather than trying to diminish it. But I promise you, I will do everything in my power to ensure she is safe and happy." Mr. Whitmore's eyes focused on Edward with surprising intensity. "You love her." It was not a question, but Edward answered anyway. "Yes, sir. More than I have ever loved anyone." "Good," Mr. Whitmore whispered. "She deserves everything. Don't let her settle for less." "I won't," Edward promised. "I give you my word." Mr. Whitmore nodded slightly, then his eyes closed again, consciousness slipping away. But there had been a moment of understanding, and Edward felt as though he had received something precious, not quite approval, but perhaps the beginning of it. Dawn broke grey and rainless. Edward was stiff from sitting in the chair all night, but he remained at his post until Clara appeared in the doorway just past 6 o'clock. She had changed her clothes and tidied her hair, but exhaustion still marked her features. "You stayed," she said softly. "I gave you my word," Edward replied. "Your father woke briefly around midnight. He knew you were resting and seemed content with that." Clara moved to her father's bedside, checking his breathing, adjusting his blankets with gentle hands. "Thank you," she said without looking at Edward, "for staying, for caring." "Clara, I am still angry with you," she interrupted, finally meeting his eyes, "for the months of coldness, for making me feel as though my very nature was flawed, for pushing me away when all I wanted was to be allowed close." "I know," Edward said steadily. "You have every right to be angry. But I am also grateful," Clara continued, "for this, for coming here, for helping when you had no obligation to do so, for saying things I needed to hear, even if I'm not ready to trust them completely." "What do you need, Clara?" Edward asked quietly. "Tell me what you need and I will provide it." She was quiet for a long moment, her hand resting on her father's. "I need someone who stays," she said finally. "Not because duty requires it, not because it serves some strategic purpose, but because they choose to, because they want to be here even when it's difficult and painful and offers no advantage." "Then I will stay," Edward replied simply, "for as long as you'll allow it." Over the following days, Edward proved the truth of his words. He remained at the Whitmore estate, taking up residence in a guest room, rather than returning to London or even retreating to the village inn. He made himself useful in whatever ways were needed, managing correspondence, dealing with estate matters that required a gentleman's authority, providing companionship to Mrs. Whitmore when Clara was with her father. But mostly, he simply stayed. He sat with Clara during long evening hours after her father had fallen into laudanum-induced sleep. They did not always speak. Sometimes they sat in comfortable silence, Clara working on needlework she would inevitably unpick the next day, Edward reading or pretending to read while actually watching her profile in the candlelight. When they did speak, they talked of inconsequential things at first, books they had read, places they had visited, opinions on parliamentary matters they both followed. But gradually, as Clara began to trust his continued presence, the conversations deepened. She told him about her childhood, about a father who had treated her as an intellectual equal from the time she could first form arguments, about a mother who had taught her that strength came in many forms. She spoke of her fear of losing her father, of the gaping void his death would leave in her life. Edward, in turn, found himself speaking of things he rarely discussed, his relationship with his own father, distant but not unkind, his brother's death, and the weight of unexpectedly inheriting. even haltingly about Beatrice and the lesson she had taught him about trusting his heart. "She taught you the wrong lesson," Clara said when he had finished. "She taught you that caring makes you vulnerable to exploitation. But that's only true when you care for people who don't value what you offer. The right person, someone who truly loves you, would never use your heart against you." "I am beginning to understand that," Edward admitted. "Though understanding intellectually and believing emotionally are two different things. Then I shall simply have to prove it to you," Clara said softly. "If you'll let me." The words hung between them, heavy with implication. "Clara," Edward began carefully, "I don't want you to feel obligated." "I don't feel obligated," she interrupted. "I feel hopeful, tentatively, carefully hopeful. You have been here nearly a week, Edward. You have asked nothing of me except the chance to be helpful. You have been patient when I've been short-tempered, understanding when I've been overwhelmed. You have shown me through action, not words, that you meant what you said." "I did mean it," Edward confirmed. "I do mean it." "I know," Clara said, and smiled. Not the full, radiant smile he had first witnessed, but something softer, more intimate. Something meant only for him. "I am beginning to believe you." It was more than Edward had dared hope for. Mr. Whitmore died peacefully on the 8th day after Edward's arrival, with his wife and daughter at his bedside. Edward kept his distance during those final hours, maintaining vigil in the corridor outside the bedchamber, ready to provide whatever support might be needed, but understanding his presence in that most private of moments would be intrusive. When Clara emerged, her face wet with tears, Edward simply opened his arms. She walked into them without hesitation, and he held her while she wept for her father, for the loss of a man who had shaped her so profoundly, for the future that would be forever marked by his absence. "I've got you," Edward murmured against her hair. "I'm here, and I've got you." And this time, when he said it, Clara believed him. The funeral took place 4 days later, a service that drew parliamentary colleagues and reformers from across England, all come to pay respect to a man who had changed the course of social legislation through sheer force of moral conviction. Edward stood with Clara throughout, a silent presence at her side, offering support through proximity rather than words. He did not try to shield her from her grief or tell her how to feel. He simply remained present, steady, allowing her to lean on him when she needed, and giving her space when she required solitude. It was in the evening after the funeral, when most guests had departed and the house had settled into the heavy silence of fresh morning, that Clara sought him out in the library, where he had retreated to give the family privacy. "Walk with me?" she asked from the doorway. Edward rose immediately. "Of course." They walked through the gardens in the twilight, the late summer air finally clear after days of rain. Neither spoke for a long while, both content with silence and each other's company. Finally, Clara stopped beside an old fountain, its stone worn smooth by centuries of water. She turned to face Edward, and in the fading light, her expression was serious, but not sad. "I have been thinking," she began carefully, "about what you said, about earning my forgiveness, about proving yourself through action rather than words." Edward's heart began to race, but he kept his expression neutral. "Yes, you have done that," Clara continued. "This past week and a half, you have been everything I needed without asking anything in return. You have been patient, supportive, present. You have proven, to me, to my mother, to yourself, that you are capable of being more than the cold, distant Earl I first encountered." "Clara, let me finish," she said gently. "Please." Edward nodded, not trusting his voice. "My father told me, the day before he died, that you had promised him something. He was barely conscious, and I thought perhaps he had dreamed it, but he seemed quite certain you had given your word about something important." Edward's throat tightened. He had not realized Mr. Whitmore had remembered that midnight conversation. "What did you promise him, Edward?" Clara asked softly. "I promised," Edward said carefully, "that I would ensure you had everything you deserved, that I would never allow you to settle for less than the happiness and respect you merited, that I would cherish your strength rather than trying to diminish it." Clara's eyes grew bright with tears. "That sounds remarkably like a promise one might make when asking permission to court someone." "It was," Edward admitted. Though your father was kind enough not to demand I make a formal request when he was barely conscious, I would have preferred to ask properly when he could grant or deny me with full awareness of what I was requesting. He granted it, Clara said quietly. He told me the next morning that he had given his blessing to that Earl who finally pulled his head from his arse. Those were his exact words, though he blamed the laudanum for the vulgarity, and that I should not be too hard on you because even good men sometimes require considerable time to recognize what matters most. Despite the gravity of the moment, Edward felt a laugh escape. Your father was a wise man. He was, Clara agreed, and I think he would be pleased to know I intend to follow his advice. Edward's breath caught. Clara, I love you, Edward Ashford, Clara said, her voice steady despite her tears. I have loved you since before I had any sensible reason to do so. I loved you when you told me to guard my smiles. I loved you when you pushed me away. I loved you when you held me while I cried. And I love you now, standing in my father's garden, asking you to be brave enough to love me back without fear, without reservation, without the walls you've spent years constructing. Edward felt something fundamental shift in his chest, as though his heart had been frozen for 15 years and was finally painfully thawing. I am terrified, he admitted honestly. I am terrified of hurting you, of failing you, of proving inadequate to the gift you're offering. I am terrified that I have forgotten how to be the kind of man worthy of someone like you. Then we shall learn together, Clara said simply. Because I am terrified too. Terrified of trusting this, of believing it's real, of opening my heart fully, only to have it rejected again. But I would rather be terrified and brave than safe and alone, wouldn't you? Edward stepped closer, raising one hand to cup her cheek, his thumb brushing away a tear. Yes, he said quietly. God help me. Yes. Then ask me, Clara whispered. Ask me properly, Edward. Not because duty requires it or strategy suggests it or because it's the logical next step. Ask me because you want to, because you love me, because you choose me. Edward's hand trembled slightly as he dropped to one knee there in the garden. Propriety be damned. He took Clara's hand in both of his, looking up at her in the twilight. Clara Whitmore, he began, his voice rough with emotion he no longer tried to suppress. I am not a demonstrative man. I am not easy to love. I carry damage that will take years to fully heal. I will make mistakes, undoubtedly many of them, because I am learning how to be vulnerable for the first time in 15 years. But I love you with every broken, imperfect piece of who I am. I love your warmth, your strength, your unshakable conviction that the world deserves your kindness. I love that you smile freely and refuse to apologize for it. I love that you have forced me to feel again, even when feeling is terrifying. And I am asking you, begging you to marry me. Not to make me a better man, though you will. Not to complete me, though you do. But because I choose you, Clara. Every day for the rest of my life, I choose you. Silence stretched for a heartbeat. 2, 3. Enough for panic to begin clawing at Edward's chest. Then Clara smiled, not the polite, contained smile she had learned to offer him, not the careful, guarded expression she had worn during their months of cool distance, but that full, radiant, unguarded smile that had first arrested his attention at Lady Pemberton's ball. The smile he had spent months trying to extinguish and would now spend a lifetime trying to deserve. Yes, she said simply. Yes, Edward, I will marry you. I choose you too. Edward rose, pulling her into his arms with perhaps more force than was strictly proper, but propriety had ceased to matter somewhere between his arrival in Hampshire and this moment. He held her tightly, burying his face in her hair, and allowed himself to feel, really feel joy for the first time in years. I love you, he murmured against her temple. I will say it as often as you need to hear it until you believe it completely. I believe it, Clara replied, her arms tight around him. But I will never object to hearing it regardless. They stood in the garden as full darkness fell, two people who had both been damaged by life in different ways, finding unexpected wholeness in each other's arms. Edward Ashford, the Earl who had forbidden her to smile, who had rejected the gift of her warmth because he was too afraid to accept it, had finally learned the lesson his marble heart had required. That true strength lay not in building walls, but in having the courage to let them fall for the right person. And Clara Whitmore, who had loved him when he least deserved it, who had been brave enough to keep loving him even when he pushed her away, had taught him that some smiles, the real ones, the ones offered freely to those who cherished them, were worth any risk, any vulnerability, any amount of fear. "Take me home, Edward," Clara whispered. "Where is home?" he asked, genuinely uncertain whether she meant Hampshire or London or some other place entirely. Clara pulled back just enough to look at him, and her smile was radiant in the darkness. "Wherever you are," she said simply. "Home is wherever you are." And Edward, who had spent 15 years believing he was safer alone, finally understood what he had been missing. That the greatest safety, the truest peace, came not from isolation but from allowing someone to truly see him, damaged, imperfect, terrified, and choosing to stay regardless. He had collapsed when she smiled for another man, his carefully constructed walls crumbling in the face of jealousy he could not deny. But he had risen again, rebuilt himself into someone capable of deserving that smile, and claimed it, not through pride or position or aristocratic expectation, but through the simple, terrifying act of being vulnerable enough to love. It was, he thought as he kissed her for the first time beneath a sky full of stars, worth every moment of fear, worth everything.